a possible performative context to the extent that we can imagine what it might have been, and to examine these things not just from the perspective of a Hellenist, but also with the Indo-European background and wider comparative perspective in mind. The undergirding of my talk today, C11, is a single point I make in the first of these papers, titled Gods and Vowels, an observation that is obvious, but appears not to have been previously made. It is, in short, this, and you will forgive me, I hope, for spending what will end up being rather a lot of time setting up the issue before turning to Avesta. So here it is. It's that the first word of both of Hesiod's poems is a form of musa, muse, musaon heliconiadon archomethaedein, from the Heliconian muses, let us begin to sing, and musai pieriethin aoidesi cleusai enepite, muses from Pieria, glorifying by songs, sing. And the same word appears as a vocative in the middle of the first verse of Homer's Odyssey, andramoi enepe musa, of the man sing to me, O muse. But what of the fourth of our most archaic poems? The one indeed is often given primacy, Homer's Iliad, which begins menin aede theia, of the wrath, sing, O goddess. Well, the muse is here in the first verse as well, but in the guise of goddess, theia, a word whose form, more curious than it might at first appear, I have discussed in one of the more recent papers in the series. But never mind about that just now. What is relevant is the first word of the poem, the accusative menin, said of Achilles, whose Proto-Indo-European root, if we accept a classic argument of Calvert-Watkins, and with less precision Eduard Schweitzer before him, is mnech, keep in mind. And this diachronic glance is fruitful because mnech is widely believed to be an extension of the basic root men, think, and men is widely believed, and again it's Watkins who has helped illuminate the path, men is believed to lie behind the word musa. One reason to believe in this constellation of connections comes from Vedic. Musa could, without special pleading, be, and in my view, in reality is, almost exactly cognate with muntu in Sanskrit, which means caring or mindful. But another reason is Greek internal. The Muses are marked in their collective designation as the progeny of mnemosune, memory, by virtue of the fact that her name unquestionably reflects the extended root mnech. As for the semantics, we might say, from an Avestan point of view, that the Muses and mnemosune are personified vohu mano, good thinking, while menis is their opposite, akam mano. What all this means is that there is a lovely diachronic dimension hidden behind the synchronic fact, mildly interesting in itself, but evident, that one or more muses feature at the start of all four of our earliest poems, in a form of musa in 3 of these instances, and at the absolute beginning of 2 of them. If we adopt a historical perspective, which allows us to peer into the shadowy background of archaic bardic practice, it turns out that men, as in Musa, or mnech, as in Menis, features at the start of all 4 poems, and as the very first syllable of 3. That, however one wishes to date them, have the greatest claim on antiquity, that is to say the Iliad, the Theogony, and the Works and Days. Furthermore, C12, one of 2 alternative beginnings to the Iliad, comes from the so-called Archaia Ilias, or Old Iliad, purportedly found in the library of a Pelecon of Teos. This version opens unfamiliarly, with Musas aedo kai Apollono klutotoxon, of the Muses I sing, and Apollo of the famed bow, unfamiliarly, and yet with another paradigmatic form of Musa as first word, thereby showing one more connection still between Menis and Musa, and indeed between the fuller collocations of accusative object and verb of song, menin aede, and musas a do. Finally, and you can turn now to page 2 of the handout, the Homeric hymn to Apollo, one of the 4 major hymns, has as its very first word mnesomai, let me remember, a form of the verb mimneskomai, which, like its nominal counterpart mnemosune, goes back to mnech. Remarkably then, C2 on the handout, we can use linguistics to reconstruct literature. That is to say, to reconstruct linguistic material in a highly specific poetic context. C2.1. I stress in a highly specific poetic context, because to my knowledge, the niceties of what we may risk overstating the case to call Proto-Indo-European literature have hitherto all been things that some speakers of the language employ occasionally, but as far as I am aware, thoroughly unpredictably. Such phonetic and morphosyntactic figures as alliteration, Behagel's law, figurae etymologica, and phrases about swift horses and imperishable fame. In the present case, it is true, the reconstruction gives us not much more than an opening syllable. But this is one syllable better than we otherwise can do, and I, for one, find it actually quite exciting to think that we know how our earliest hymns may have been sung, or at least begun, as men or mnech in absolute poem initial position, followed, though it would not make sense for me to go through the evidence here, by a word that denotes singing and the name of a divinity. The reason it is possible to do this, C22, comes from what I have dubbed the Julie Andrews principle, after the actress who plays Maria von Trapp in the 1965 film The Sound of Music. The beginning, as she explains to her young Austrian charges, is a very good place to start. It is indeed. But why? Well, the beginning is one of only a few spots in a text that qualify as privileged positions in the terminology of literary critic Peter J. Rabinowitz. In traditional, that is to say, passed down oral narrative, and no one doubts that Homer, Hesiod, and the hymns are, or at some point in the not very distant past, were oral and passed down from generation to generation. In traditional oral narrative, there is one position that most definitely counts, and that is the start. If you are a bard who does something totally different in verse 1000, maybe you're a celebrity, maybe you're a renegade, but you're doing what bards do. If, however, you are a bard who does something totally different in verse 1, then there's a real chance that you're so much of a renegade that you're breaking tradition, and it will cause you to be thrown out of the bardic guild. But what a great bard can do is tweak the tradition in verse 1 so that it remains traditional while also bearing his own stamp. However, and now in 2.3, I'm finally making a move in the Iranian direction. However, it is more than a little embarrassing that I have in my work on poetic incipits so far said very little about how the Greek material might be connected to what we find in other Indo-European traditions. Embarrassing because how can I dare speak of Proto-Indo-European literature when all I have done is claim that Proto-Indo-European roots of 5,500 or so years ago can help elucidate material from late Bronze Age Greek from only about 2,800 years ago, which is to say exactly in the middle of the tradition that spans from then to now. How can I do this? Surely other languages and other texts should help us understand the status of mindful poetic incipits in the millennia between the proto-language and Homer. Surely I should not be making grand claims without looking at the evidence beyond Mount Olympus and Mount Helicon. Well, there is, I admit, one two-sentence thing I have had to say about where to go from here, which I quote now from the lightly revised and I hope also lightly improved version of Gods and Vowels that was published earlier this year. I quote myself, "A plausible next step would be to return to the Vedic material, starting with Rig Veda 1.1. What has since ancient times been the first hymn of the collection, parenthesis, though it does not belong linguistically to the oldest stratum, close parenthesis, begins with the vowel a in the name of the fire god Agni, whose paradigm is then given polyptonically. I apologize for quoting myself, but the fact is that this was not actually one of my brighter ideas. Yes, the initial accusative, agnim of 1-1, followed directly by the verb of speech ire, I praise, fits the pattern of menen, aede, and the like. Yes, there is something interesting about the vowel a, though this is not a matter of concern today. And yes, I brought up the polyptoton because it does resemble what we find in the proeme of Hesiod's Works and Days. But all that said, what is culturally regarded as the first hymn of the Rig Veda can hardly be primary from a deep linguistic point of view, for one thing, because it is not in the so-called family books. A brighter idea, then, would surely have been, and surely still will be, to look for reflexes of men or mnech in appropriate texts in other archaic traditions. And for reasons of both genre and subgrouping, the traditions with which to begin are obviously Indic and Iranian. Genre, because Old Avestan and Vedic both attest to plenty of hymnic poetry with which our archaic Greek material is regularly and sensibly compared. Subgrouping, because no one doubts that these languages and Greek composed in full, or more likely in substantial part, an intermediate stage between the proto-language and our attested tongues. I expect to turn my attention to India in Los Angeles next month. But now I come finally in 3 on the handout to our most archaic Iranian texts, the Old Avestan Gāthas. The Gāthas, as we all know, were composed, supposedly by one Zarathustra, sometime in the considerable span between the middle of the 2nd millennium and the 600s BC, though comparison with Vedic demonstrates that much of the formulaic language would have been at home considerably earlier still. One does not have to have much of a grasp on Zoroastrianism to understand, C3.1, why these hymns might be both a very good and a very bad place to search for clues of the kind I have indicated. After all, some of the most important concepts in the religion, and thus most frequent words throughout the corpus, are clear reflexes of men. The verbal root man, of course, which means think, as in the aorist manta, and also the nouns manach, thought, mantra, translated into English variously as sacred utterance, formula, or as Stanley liked to have it, precept, mainu, spirit, and of course Mazda, as in Ahura Mazda. The semantic range is coherent, though perhaps not blindingly obvious. And to see just how interesting it is, it will help to return for a moment in 3.2 to Greek. You will remember that one of my contentions is that the prototypical opening phrase of an archaic Greek hymn brings together 3 things that may well have been present in some proto-incipit. A form of the root of mental activity and memory, men, which has a marked tendency to lie behind the bard's very first sounds, a word for singing or song, and a god or goddess. Since the bard is divinely inspired, and since his 2 main functions are to remember and to call these memories to the collective mind of the populace by means of song, none of this is culturally surprising. Nor, as a result, is it linguistically surprising, I contend, that these functions are sometimes blurred. The muses are literally mental goddesses, and the Hellenist William Stephen Moran notes that forms of mimneskomai, remember, like that future mnesomai that opens the hymn to Apollo, refer specifically to bardic memory as, to quote him, instantiated through song. They may even be translated, in his view, as remember sing. Still, what we find in Avestan one-ups even this, since we do not need to resort to something as clumsy as remember sing to see that reflexes of the root men refer all at once, in one and the same text, to thought, as in manta, to divinity, Mainyu and Mazda, and to what may be song and is in any case a special kind of speech, Mantra, for which the etymologically inspired German rendering Denkspruch seems apt and not at all clumsy. So where does this leave us? C3.3. It might seem as though the task I have set myself is unnecessary, not to say both tedious and trivial. All I have to do is comb through the text to see where reflexes of men appear and then catalog them. True, and I fully admit that this is not a spectacular talk. Nonetheless, while there is a lot of evidence for forms of men in the Gathas, including umpteen instances in which forms cluster together, for example, in Yasna 29:7, Mantra followed by Mazda followed by Manonha, these are for the most part not very interesting because they tend to appear in positions that are, so to speak, unprivileged. For what is obviously at issue is whether men appears in textual and performance contexts with which one might plausibly compare the beginnings of our oldest Greek poetry. Potentially highly dispiriting for my project is, however, this, and please turn now to page 4 of the handout. When we examine the 17 yasnas that make up the Gathas, and we can add in the yasna Haptanghaiti as well, we discover how few forms there are that reflect men in the first verse of any of them. There is, for example, not a single verbal form of man in a first verse, not a single form of mantra, and only 2 instances of mainyu, one of which is in Yasna 28:1, to which I will return in a minute. If we exclude from consideration the enigmatic hapax manoi in 32:1, what we find is that the forms that do appear are almost all of Mazda and Manach. It will probably not surprise anyone to learn that Mazda appears at the start of 12 of the yasnas, 70% of them. More surprising, perhaps, is the ubiquity of Manonha and Manonho, which between them appear at the start of 6. And not just at the start, these forms are extremely common throughout a number of the hymns. For example, in the 11-verse Yasna 28, which has 8 instances across 7 of the verses. So here's a question. How do the Gathas begin? If men should be at the beginning of the beginning, what is the beginning? The first yasna in all editions is 28, but might the situation perhaps be comparable to that of Rigveda 1:1, which leads the way, and for good reasons, but these reasons do not stand up to deep philological scrutiny? Do we have any cause to believe that the material in Yasna 28 reflects an especially old linguistic or cultural stratum, at least as far as incipits are concerned? I believe the answer is yes, and that along with Yasna 44, 28 does in some sense have priority, though I stress that my claim goes no further than that these 2 yasnas bear a certain resemblance to Greek material that suggests compositional archaism. Unlike, say, Marty Schwartz, who has argued that Yasna 29 was composed first, I will not venture into further speculation about either compositional or post-compositional order. Still, there is, in my view, something special about Yasna 28 and Yasna 44, and to explain why, I turn in 4 on the handout to, of all things, anagrams, or perhaps I should say, manograms. The form manach, thought, is of course an S stem, C4:1. Another S stem that looks very much like it, and is indeed pretty much the same word inside out from a phonetic point of view, is nemach, reverence. This word is far less common in the Gathas than manach, though, like manach, most of its occurrences have even more nasal-heavy forms in oncha and oncho. Now, forms of nemach appear in 2 first verses, in Yasna 28:1 and Yasna 44:1, the latter in 2 different guises, both nemoncho and the nominative nemach. So what? Well, the first thing to note is this. While forms of manach show up without nearby forms of nemach, all the time, nearly all instances of Numach are correlated with Monach. 28:1, 34:3, 43:9, 44:1, 49:10, 56:58, and 51:20. The only two instances that do not are 45:8 and, I have to say very amusingly, 51:5, which otherwise contains what is perhaps the most striking instance of an anagram in the entire collection, noticed by Stephanie over 15 years ago in Stanley's Festschrift. The point is that reverence implies thought. For Zarathustra, Numach implies Monach. There's still more to say. Consider in 4.2 the very beginning of the Gathas as the collection has come down to us, 28.1. It begins promisingly, containing as it does the iconic form Pauruim first. This immediately after Mein Yush Mazda, which is sandwiched between Nemancha and Mononcha, the latter of which rounds in the following verse, 28.2, which has both Mononcha and Mononcho in the same prominent metrical position. I will forbear translation and hope you won't think that a cop-out, because my argument is fundamentally structural rather than semantic, which in the case of the Gathas is frankly just as well, since with all respect to my many Avestan teachers, including Stanley, the renderings into other tongues often sound as though they come from another planet. In any case, Yasna 28 is a good beginning of the Gathas. But from an Indo-European point of view, 44 may be even better. See 4.3. This hymn famously starts each verse with the phrase, Tatva prasa brishmoy vausha akura. This I ask thee, tell me truly, Lord. But because it starts each verse, it is in a way not so much the beginning of the text as a paratextual tag. And if that is so, then the first word in some interesting sense is actually Nemancho, which is followed almost immediately by Numach. And then there is the last word, Mononcha. The combination is really very special, since it shows both playfulness on Zarathustra's part with an inherited trope and adherence to an inherited compositional technique. First, the trope in 4.4. As I have said, what a great bard can do is tweak the tradition in verse 1 so that it remains traditional while also bearing his own stamp. Traditional, as I have endeavored to demonstrate, is that archaic hymns begin with a reflex of the root men, often as the very first syllable. In the Greek beginnings we have examined, the lexical and semantic outlier is evidently menen. And my supposition is that the poet of the Iliad, call him Homer, tweaked the tradition by putting at the head a less obvious instantiation of men or mnech than the musas of the old Iliad, a move that had the added attractiveness of being phonetically unusually resonant thanks to a piling up of nasals. Similarly, I suggest, but in a more extreme way, the poet of the Gathas, call him Zarathustra, in turning the religion, also turns the memorable first word. We have Nemancho rather than expected Mononcho. Finally, C4.5, one last, or rather first to last technique. Nemancho is Zarathustra's initial tweak, but the verse ends with what ought to have come first, Mononcho. We have, in other words, a ring. Rings are very common in Indo-European, as Calvert and Martin West have observed, and were arguably at home in the poetic proto-language. They are, in any case, especially important structuring devices in archaic Greek poems, including those with whose opening words I began this morning. 3 of the 4 major Homeric hymns, as well as some of the others, both begin and end with a form that reflects one or both of the Proto-Indo-European roots men and hued. That is to say, 12 of the hymns, including the already mentioned one to Apollo, which begins Mnesamai. All of these end with the formula Mnesam Aoides, I shall remember a song, and 2 other ones have Musa or Aedein in the opening verse. In addition, as Watkins notes, The 10-verse proem to the Works and Days, which is in effect a detachable hymn and thus the same genre as the Homeric hymns, marks its start and finish with the ring mu psi mu the psi main, which is not a proper diachronic etymology but a synchronic jingle, though I have added to what Watkins says that there is what one might call a diachronic jingle as well, because mu psi, from men, and the final middle ending, main, sound alike. And this is especially interesting in view of the relationship between the Muses and the opening meinin of the Iliad. Speaking of which, there's also the tiny phonetic ring in the first 6 words of the Iliad itself, from meinin at the start of the first verse to enjammed ulo menein, with which it is in grammatical concord at the start of the second. But a proper discussion of that phrase must await another occasion. I've used up my time, and then some. Not wisely, some of you may think, for this is the smallest of small-scale efforts. Still, and with great thanks to Laura for the invitation to be here at this exceptionally invigorating conference, I hope to have demonstrated one thing, namely that what a good bard does, as opposed to a hack, is, in Avestan, in Greek, and elsewhere, to take the inherited tradition and make it his own. This is what Zarathustra did religiously in a profound bouleversement, and it is also, I believe, what he did in a small but significant way by thinking of his beginning as reverential thought. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Discussion is open. 5 minutes. Laura.
Yeah. Thank you for the very nice talk, which I enjoyed very much. I have, just a short parallel, but you probably know, I tried to check your dots and vowels, but I couldn't find it in my laptop in order to see if you quoted it. And it's, of course, from Pindar, a poet who called the Musai Namonoi, and it's a sort of monogram in Pindar, and it's the beginning of a Nemean 3, which is Opotnia Moisa Matera Metera.
I don't quote it. What I'm trying to remember now, I think either Schwartz or Watkins were both pointed that out, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Could be maybe Watkins, because you have this a similar thing, like a parallel it could be in the Rig Veda 10:32, which is Mata Mantu, and so
that I have not noticed. Thank you.
Because it's a parallel. It's kind of nice because it supports also this, Pindar.
Pindar's Rig Veda, yes.
Yeah. Yes, and also probably the folk etymological connections.
Yeah, that's
just
great.
Short.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other question, comment? Yes.
Thank you. I have a question on what you said about the root menek being an extension of the root men.
Yeah.
So the first question is, what are there any clear parallels for ek as such a suffix making an extension? And the second question is, isn't it true that menos in Greek denotes more like a demotic kind of spirit, like energy? And if so, and if this is the original meaning, how do you arrive at the meaning to remember from that?
Right. Well, so the first one is well, they're both very fair questions. The first one is completely fair, and actually I have no good answer to it at all. There's only sleight of hand here. I've never seen anybody explain how, from a formal point of view, one would get net from men. The assumption, and this is not a very good answer at all, I fully grant, is that they look and sound alike and they have roughly the same meaning, so of course they're somehow going to have to be connected. I'm not terribly bothered by this, because in what one might call a worst case scenario, it's hard to believe that they weren't somehow connected in the minds of speakers very early on. But from a purely mechanical point of view of inner Indo-European derivation, I actually have no idea how that works. Menos, yes. Well, Menos is very interesting. We know, of course, that Menos in collocations is old. Hieron Menos and Ishi Vena Manasa. The amusing thing about hieron menos is that the most common use is in the formula hieron menos alkinoio, and of course, how do you translate that? Well, you translate that maybe as the holy menos of a guy whose name is strong Noos, and as you know, there are cognates of hieron that mean very much like alke. So it basically looks like the strong mind of strong mind. And so then I pumped the question. So menos obviously meant something like noos. And okay, I mean, is noos thumatic, as you put it, or is it mental? How would we know? I mean, they all seem to go together. And the fact that you're allowed to have menos and noos be, at least as far as this formula is concerned, roughly, I would say the same thing, means that I'm not terribly worried about this stuff versus the thumos, wherever the thumos sits in the body, somewhere between, here and here.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, it's done. So
Great.
it's time to welcome, thank you again. And we now go from the new to Aphrodite with John McDonald's fever. And Aphrodite's blood, and it's Cognates, east and west.
Thank you very much. How do we get this screen activated? That was easy. Good morning. So as you can see from the title of my presentation, I'm going to endeavor to make a triangular comparison. And as we all know, it's a very time-consuming occupation. Therefore, in order to do it in approximately 20 minutes, I'm going to have to speak very quickly. So, courage. Hold on to your seats. Here we go. Absolutely, yes. Now, how does one do that? There's a light expert over here. Thank you. Is that better? Okay, here we go. So, I'm going to examine an episode from Book 5 of the Iliad. It's very famous because it has a lot of quirky and unexpected details, and they don't seem to hang together very nicely from an internal synchronic perspective. But when pursued from a diachronic and comparative perspective, things start to fall into place. This vase painting encapsulates the central episode. What happens, just to distill it to the essential details relevant to this presentation, Diomedes encounters Aeneas on the battlefield and proceeds to attack him. Athena not only eggs him on in terms of the combat between the two mortal heroes, she actually encourages him to lash out at any gods who might try to intervene, Aphrodite in particular. And why would Aphrodite really care to be so interested in this instance? Well, it's because Aeneas is, of course, her son. When he's in mortal peril, she swoops down onto the battlefield and she attempts to abscond with her son to protect him, but she fails to do so because Diomedes attacks her, and indeed he actually wounds her and draws the divine equivalent of blood. So here he is lashing out at the goddess. She is indeed wounded. It's a scratch, but there's a trickle of blood that emerges. And so she escaped from the battlefield by hopping into the chariot of her husband Ares and ascending up to Mount Olympus. And she goes there, largely it seems, to take comfort from her parents, Zeus and his wife Dione. Dione is not a very well-known goddess, and that's part of the mystery of this episode. We'll get a bit more into it in the following slides, but here is one of the mere handful of depictions of Dione here. She's together with her daughter Aphrodite, and they're fighting against giants on the Pergamum altar. Okay, so Iliad 5. In this 20-something minute presentation, I cannot do all of this, but long story short, it's what I call a magnet for hereditary lore and language. There are all sorts of elements that aren't even necessarily closely linked or related that are brought together in this episode, and they all have something to do with Indo-European heritage. So that kind of makes me feel good about making this comparison that I'm about to launch into, because there are all these other elements that are ancillary to what I'm going to discuss that also seem to have their ancestry goes back to an Indo-European tradition. Even the use of this word "ichor" to describe the blood of Aphrodite, it's a marked word for blood. It's in direct contrast with haima for mortal or human blood. And Calvert Watkins contextualized these two terms and many others from Greek, Indic, Norse, Celtic, in this very famous essay that kind of got that topic rolling, and people have pursued it since then in many other different formats. Another thing that seems to be potentially going back to, at least has a resonance with an Indo-European phenomenon, is this combination of Zeus and Iommi, sky and Mrs. Sky, and the suffix to create the wife of Zeus. George Dunkel claims that it's reminiscent of Indra and Indrani, that same cohabitation, and then even the morphology seems to be connected. And of course, Indra, he's sort of like, in some respects, the equivalent of Zeus in his tradition. So it's a somewhat compelling comparison. Again, this is just to give you guys an idea that there are all of these other elements that aren't going to be part of the presentation that have congealed in the context of Book 5 of the Iliad, and they go back to an Indo-European tradition. Watkins repeatedly comes back to Book 5 of the Iliad in How to Kill a Dragon, all sorts of phraseological things going on. Dr. Sciarva has an essay comparing Zarathustra and Diomedes, in particular using stones as weapons. So it's kind of like what we were talking a little about yesterday, but not smashing a stone, using the stone to smash an opponent instead. So Diomedes is kind of playing with that lore to a certain extent, but with a bit of a twist on it. And then Emily West also has a very interesting essay where she makes comparisons between the Aristeia of Diomedes and episodes in the Mahabharata. So there's all this other stuff going on. Now, I'm going to now focus in on something very particular. Zeus and Iommi, it's bizarre. I mean, of course, it seems very conventional because it's the Homeric version, but outside of the realm of Homeric hexameter poetry, this is not the parentage of Aphrodite. In fact, Aphrodite doesn't have parents. She's born on the sea. These are, of course, these famous artistic depictions of this event, but the event wasn't really quite as sanitized as we get in these famous artistic versions. It goes back, of course, to this very violent action where Uranos is castrated by his son Kronos, and the genitals plunge down into the sea, and it's the scum and the blood that forms on the surface of the sea that ends up generating Aphrodite. So she doesn't have a mother or a father, no Zeus, no Dione. She's blood and sea scum turned into a goddess, right? So people are bothered by this because even though, like I said, it's the Homeric version, so it's got a lot of clout, it's not at all the standard version. Authors outside of the Homeric tradition, they don't pursue that avenue. Aphrodite has this other, much more gory origin. But of course, something can come to the rescue. It's the Epic of Gilgamesh, because there's a very unshakable comparison to be made with Tablet 6 of the Gilgamesh epic and this episode of Book 5 of the Iliad. A very sexually aggressive goddess, Ishtar, she approaches the hero Gilgamesh and she attempts to seduce him quite aggressively. But what's interesting is he repels her advances and he says, "No way, Jose, I don't want to get involved because I know the history of what happens to dudes that end up hooking up with you. Even the ones that don't quite get there, that you're just sort of, you have an eye on them, even if nothing happens, there's still negative consequences for these guys. They get turned into animals or other creatures, like her gardener, for instance, gets arguably turned into a toad, or there are other interpretations that some sort of creature. So Gilgamesh says, I'm not interested, I want nothing to do with you. And so what Ishtar proceeds to do, let me just go back a slide here, she poutily zooms up into the sky and she approaches her mother and her father, Anu, Sky, and onto Mrs. Sky, and she basically has a huge hissy fit. Okay, so it's very similar to what happens with Aphrodite in Book 5 of the Iliad, although you can see immediately that there's this erotic dimension that doesn't seem to be present in the Diomedes episode. Okay, so, however, that's, I'm just going to quickly add this, and this is a bit too complicated to go into in detail, but I have never seen anyone make this comparison that actually further solidifies the connection between the Gilgamesh tradition and Book 5 of the Iliad. There's this sort of coda to the story where after she's gone up into the sky, Ishtar says, I want to punish Gilgamesh for his insolence, give me the Bull of Heaven and let the Bull of Heaven assault him. So the Bull of Heaven is sent down. but it's in fact slaughtered by Enkidu and Gilgamesh. They team up and they slaughter the bull of heaven. They dismember it, and Enkidu actually hurls a chunk of it at the goddess Ishtar. So she's assaulted. It's kind of similar to what happens with Diomedes and Aphrodite. Okay, but here's the big problem. Book 5 of the Iliad, there's nothing sexy about it, not synchronically at least. It's true that Diomedes and Aphrodite are both very attractive, but there doesn't seem to be this erotic dimension to the narrative. It's not explicit at the very least. However, whenever Aphrodite comes swooping down in any single other instance, it's an explicitly erotic situation. In fact, her vehicles are often designed for erotic pursuits, and you can see that from the iconography of these vase paintings when she's in a chariot or riding a mount of some kind. She's surrounded by these erotes, and the whole scene is sexually charged. Okay, so when she's in her vehicles, you kind of know, and she's descending down from the heavens onto the earth, there's something sexual that's in play. And in fact, book 3 of the Iliad has sort of like an anticipation of this episode of book 5. Aphrodite again seeks to intervene, this time successfully. What she does is she swoops down and she scoops up Paris, and she rescues him from Menelaus during their duel, and she takes him to the bedroom in Troy where where Helen is residing. But Helen, everyone can tell this, it's so transparent, and Helen even makes a passive-aggressive little remark about it. Aphrodite is trying to live vicariously through Helen. She wants to experience Paris in a sexual way through Helen, and so this kind of is sort of like almost building up to the episode in book 5 of the Iliad, where there isn't an explicit sexual dimension, but here we do actually pretty much get it. And there are many other cases, I'm just going to give a couple of examples. Butes is another lover of Aphrodite, and again, the way that she acquires him is he's an Argonaut who's in danger when they pass by the sirens. She swoops down, she scoops him up, she saves him, but she also forces him into sexual slavery. So, and actually in book 5 of the Iliad itself, and I owe this understanding to Bruno Curry's book, the horses of Tros get mentioned as kind of like it's a key ingredient in the whole situation of Aeneas being attacked by Diomedes. Really what Diomedes wants more than anything else is the magical horses of Aeneas, descended from those of Tros. They were given to Tros by Zeus when Zeus absconded with Ganymede from Mount Ida. Okay, so there's, it's a pederastic version of the same kind of stuff that Aphrodite sometimes gets up to. For instance, Aphrodite herself also descends onto Mount Ida. She doesn't do any abducting, but she aggressively seduces Anchises in disguise as a Phrygian princess, and Aeneas is the offspring of that union. So this Zeus-Ganymede comparison, and the business of the horses of Tros lurking in the background in Iliad 5, it actually does really trigger this sexual connotation, in particular a connection with Aphrodite. Another thing that people have used to connect the Gilgamesh episode and book of the Iliad is the fact that in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, she prepares herself, this is before she descends to earth to seduce Anchises, she prepares herself very elaborately, like a toilette scene. And this is what Ishtar does too before she goes to do some seducing. So like I said, the relationship between the Gilgamesh tradition and the Greek stuff, it's more complicated than just like a one-to-one comparison. It's much more diffuse and elaborate. And in fact, another thing that makes the comparison even more complicated is that the story of Aphrodite and Anchises, so now we're outside of the realm of book 5 of the Iliad, but we're in sort of peripherally related traditions. Aeneas, he kind of has a negative outcome from this whole situation, or sorry, Anchises rather, because he blabs about what happened with him and Aphrodite. She warned him not to do it. She said something bad will happen if you do so, but he did it anyway. And so Zeus throws a thunderbolt at him, and he is impaired from that point onward. So it's sort of like what happens to the gardener of Ishtar and so on and so forth. Okay. So, okay, we made it to India, right? This is good. It's a good start at least. India. All right, I'm going to now show you that there are very compelling Indo-European comparisons to be made as well, and that necessarily complicates the relationship between the Gilgamesh stuff and the Iliad. Okay, so Rig Veda 430. It's very tersely narrated as per usual, so we don't really know the full story, but there's some sort of conflict between Indra and Ushas, the dawn goddess, the daughter of Dyaush, the sky god. She's angry, presumably at Indra, although that's already an assumption, and he encounters her in some sort of hostile context. He assaults her and he smashes the wagon that she's riding in, and she flees far away, maybe up into the sky the same way that Aphrodite goes to Olympus, and Ishtar goes up into the heavens as well. Now, Eos is the most obvious direct correspondent in Greece to Ushas, etymologically and functionally in many respects, no doubt about that. But with respect to the fact that Ushas is the only goddess who is said to be the daughter of Diaush, so like a very specific part of her mythology, well, then we need to look further afield because that's not the case for Ushas. Eos. She's kind of passed on that aspect of her hereditary biography to other goddesses, in particular Aphrodite, who on numerous occasions in Book 5 of the Iliad is, as you can guess from the fact that she's going to go up to Olympus and see Daddy Zeus, she's called the daughter of Zeus on numerous occasions. And the phraseological comparison is etymologically perfect. Okay, the Greeks are well aware of this. I'm going to do this really quickly. So the Greeks are fully aware of the fact that Aphrodite has absorbed all of these facets of the dawn goddess and kind of siphoned them off of Eos. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite is the locus classicus of this whole dynamic. I won't go into the details, but basically Eos abducting Tithonus from Ida is used by Aphrodite herself in her own hymn as a mythological comparison for what she's about to do with Anchises also on Mount Ida. This is, of course, also not the only instance in which Aphrodite finds herself on Mount Ida in a sexually charged situation. That's where she obtains the golden apple from Paris after she's basically stripped off all of her clothing and paraded around in front of him for a while. Okay. This vase painting, I'm not going to do it in any detail, but it's an iconographical piece of evidence that shows, again, Eos and Aphrodite are in perfect harmony in the ways they're represented on this vase. So the Greeks, they're aware of this. They know what's going on. All right. I'm going to skip the cannibalism slide. All right. Now, another dimension that I want to layer onto this comparison. There are these wheeled vehicles surfacing in both the Greek narrative and in the Indic narrative. They're used very differently. It's true. However, let's just start with that and see if we can take it any further. So Aphrodite is going to escape from the Trojan battlefield in the chariot of her husband Ares, and Indra encounters Ushas, and she's being driven or conveyed in this wagon. So, it's definitely pretty different, but okay, let's at least see if we can push that a little bit further in a few slides. There are also tons of other things that bring Ushas and Aphrodite and Eos into a triangular mush. And again, I can't do it in any huge detail, but Ushas, she has this pernicious effect on mortals, and it's referenced on multiple occasions. In particular, she seems to be responsible for aging them. And that's what Eos is terribly guilty of when she makes her stupid mistake and immortalizes Tithonus, but forgets to ask for perpetual youth. He eventually turns into a shriveled cicada. And it's true that Anchises, he'll have a natural old age and then eventually die, but he also suffers this injury as a consequence of his relationship with Aphrodite. And we heard from Laura's presentation yesterday a little bit about this, just in passing. Saule, the Baltic solar goddess, she also is linked to this concept of aging humans in a sinister way. So this is like the sinister side of dawn, if you want to describe it that way. Okay. Ushas is also sexually aggressive. It's not explicit that in this conflict with Indra there was anything going on. Maybe, maybe not, but certainly in many other instances, this is how she is portrayed and described. She loves to expose her breast. She does it multiple times. She approaches apparently human, mortal men in a very wanton way. And sometimes that sexual imagery is blended, apparently at least blended with bovine imagery. She's said, or it seems to be the case, that she's said to expose her breast as the cow does her udder. Okay? This is exactly Aphrodite's favorite hobby, is taking her shirt off and showing at least one of her two boobs, if not both of them. Okay, and Ushas is also really into her cosmetic appearance. So it's both like Aphrodite and like Ishtar. She's constantly ornamenting herself and using, smearing cosmetics all over herself. So she's, and clothing, fancy clothing. It's a really consistent feature of these sexually aggressive goddesses to be very concerned about their cosmetic appearance. There's also the smiling business. Okay, so again, I can't go into it in detail, but this is a persistent aspect of the Indo-European dawn goddess, is her association with her pearly whites. Okay, and cows. Okay, dawn cows. All right, these are what are used often to convey the vehicles in which Ushas is riding, but she's in a multifaceted variety of ways persistently connected with cows. It's a strong bovine association. And that, of course, is exactly what keeps resurfacing in the Greek tradition as well, with Eos and Aphrodite being obsessed with Trojan cowboys, one after the other. Anchises, Paris, Tithonus, and then Zeus also gets on the bandwagon and abducts Ganymede, the fourth Trojan cowboy, who is removed from Ida and taken up to Olympus. Okay, Bute sees Mr. Cowboy. That's the other guy that Aphrodite swoops down and scoops up and forces into sexual slavery. Aphrodite even has an epithet that means she who possesses dawn cows. At least this is how Mikhail Yanda understands the meaning of this epithet, and it's Daniel Killigan who's noticed that it's attached to Aphrodite in particular. It can also be a separate theonym altogether, like a personal name of various mythical figures. We'll come back to that. Actually, we'll do it right now. When Aphrodite goes up to Olympus and seeks comfort from Zeus and Dione, Dione says, "Oh, you poor thing, but don't worry about it. It's not the first time this kind of thing has happened. The mortals love to lash out against the gods." The first example that she gives is a very bizarre myth, is when Ares, two giants, capture him and they trap him in a bronze jar, and he is released due to the intervention of the stepmother of these giants. Her name is Eriboia, and she recruits Hermes to help Ares escape from this trap. And it's no mistake, it's no accident that Hermes is the god who's associated with the auroral/solar cattle of Greek mythology. He first imprisons them in a cave, but then he's also responsible for releasing them and exchanging them with Apollo. Okay. All right, very quickly, the Irish tertium comparationis. There are multiple dawn goddesses in Ireland. The most obvious and robust one is not the one I'm about to talk about. It's Bridget. She's the daughter of the Dagda Olafur, so basically Zeus or Diosh in the Irish tradition. And Saint Bridget is actually, if anything, more auroral than the pre-Christian goddess. She's gobbled up all of these bovine associations that are taken from the Indo-European tradition of the dawn goddess. In particular, the milkiness of the cows, or lactiferous in particular, and Watkins revisited this persistently in the scholarship. I think the final and the most extended treatment was his 2009 essay. It works on a lexical level and on a thematic level as well. Okay? So the one I'm going to talk about, though, it's another dawn goddess in Irish tradition. I only have a few slides left, I promise. It's the Morrigan. So the Morrigan is not the daughter of the Dagda, but she's his wife. So it's a bit of a glissement, if you want to describe it that way. And in the Toinbo Coolna, she gets all gussied up, right? She does her toilette, and she approaches the hero Cuchulainn in disguise as a princess, not a Phrygian one, but the next closest thing. It's very similar to what Aphrodite does with Anchises, and she attempts to seduce him. But like Ishtar, she fails. She's rejected by Cuchulainn. He doesn't say, "Oh, I don't want to get turned into a frog." He actually says, I didn't come here for a piece of ass. I came here because of the cattle raid of Cooley, so I'm not interested. But so she's rebuffed and she's furious about it. And she says, well, actually, let me quickly do this. Cuchulainn is hyper Indo-European. He's linked to Indra. He's linked to the Ashvins, all three of whom are in turn linked to Ushas. So it's no surprise that this dawn goddess figure should be linked to this hero Cuchulainn, right? So he rejects the goddess. She's furious, and she says, "I'm going to punish you for that. When you are in a ford and you're trying to cross, I'm going to transform into an eel, and I'm going to wrap myself around your feet, and I'm going to drag you underwater." And he says, "Well, then I'm going to smash you." And she says, "Well, I'll come back as a wolf, and then I'll harass you again." And he says, "I'll smash you again." And she says, "Well, I'll come back for a third time as a heifer, and I'll drive all of the cattle of Cooley into the ford, and you'll be overwhelmed by this bovine multitude." And he says, "I don't care. I'll smash you as a heifer too." And she says, "Bring it on." And it happens exactly the way it's described. That's how it unfolds. These three animal manifestations of the Morrigan attempt to attack Cuchulainn, and he smashes her on 3 successive occasions. Again, there's this freaky echo with the Gilgamesh epic, which, like I'm saying, like the Indo-European comparisons are there, but then there's also this persistent Near Eastern connection because Cuchulainn smashing the Morrigan when she's in the form of a cow, to me at least, kind of is reminiscent of the bowl of heaven being torn apart and then Ishtar being thwacked with a chunk of the carcass. Okay. Second last slide. All right, that's one version of the story. Okay, that's what we learn in the Toinbo Coolna, that it's this failed sexual encounter that results in the animosity between the hero and the goddess. But in fact, there's a Remscale, which is like a prequel, if you want to call it that, to the Toinbo Coolna, that is, the major Toin. It's called the Toin Balregovna, and it offers a different version of the story. What happens in this version is Cuchulainn sees the Morrigan driving a cow of Ulster, and she's in a chariot, and the cow is being sort of pushed forward and mooing lugubriously. And he says, well, this can't stand. I protect the cows of Ulster. So he approaches the Morrigan and he first interrogates her, and she plays all these games with him. He gets really mad at her, and he jumps up on the chariot and he sort of hovers over the Morrigan and pulls his sword on her and threatens to do violence to her. And she's like, okay, back off. So they reach some sort of, like understanding, and Cuchulainn manages to get the cow away from her, but she says, I'm going to punish you for this. I'm going to, during the toying, which I will now cause, I will attack you first as an eel, and then as a wolf, and finally as a heifer. So we're back to the wheeled vehicles, right? Again, the dawn goddess is approached by the hero when she's in a wheeled vehicle, and there's this assault that takes place. It's very reminiscent of what happens with Indra and Ushas in the Rig Veda in particular. Okay? And last but not least, this concept of narrative dislocation. So when an element that's normally bound up in a sort of like a cluster or a constellation gets removed and placed elsewhere, it's just my closing observation. I don't know if this is valid or not, but shortly before Cuchulainn dies in a horrible and violent way, that's what the first word of the Irish title of the text means, the Morrigan smashes his chariot. Okay, so there's kind of like, there's these two chariots going on. One is the Morrigan's, one is Cuchulainn's. In the Rig Veda, it's Ushas's wagon that gets smashed, and then in the Irish tradition, it's the chariot of Cuchulainn that's smashed by the dawn goddess, by the Morrigan. Okay? So my concluding sentence is, I hope to have shown you that the weird sort of facets of Book 5 of the Iliad that don't really seem to congeal or hang together very nicely when pursued from a exclusively Homeric perspective, they do actually make a little bit more sense from this diachronic and comparative perspective. If we look at it through the lens of the Indo-European dawn goddess mythology, things start to have a little bit more light shed on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes. Don't even find enough time to finish my sentence.
Thank you for this presentation, which was really nice. It's interesting that you emphasize this sexual aggressive dimension of Aphrodite and of Ushas and of the Celtic gods, because maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, but another reason for which this Iliadic book is so particular is that this is the only book in the Iliad, and it just in this very episode in which Aphrodite is not called Aphrodite but Kudris.
Yes, I know you've written about that. Yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, it's really
and you link it to like Cupido and
yeah. So I mean, in any case, you can believe or not the etymology, but I mean the synchronic etymology of Kudris is desire.
Sure.
So
it does reinforce the idea.
Fits very well in what you are arguing.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. I will add that for sure. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, what I understand, one of the major points you were trying to make was that there is connection between Mesopotamian Gilgamesh Semitic tradition and Indo-European tradition in this particular myth.
Yes.
If that is what you see, can you speculate which is the chicken and which is the egg?
No, but all I can perceive is that there are certain elements that seem to be more unique or particular to the versions descending from an Indo-European heritage. But then at the same time, like I tried to sneak it in near the end here, there are certain respects in which, like let's say for instance, the Toyn Bokulna resonates more precisely with the Gilgamesh epic and not with any other tradition, not with the Greek, not with the Vedic. So I don't really know what the path of dissemination might have been, or how this whole soup got together.
Would you speculate about it?
I could think about it. I don't know if on the spot I could speculate, but I mean, I guess my off-the-cuff perception would be that this needs to antecede the dispersal of the proto-community, and it maybe harks back to a time at which Proto-Indo-Europeans and Semitic peoples were already exchanging narrative traditions. And so maybe at the early stage of the game, all of these different elements and aspects of the narrative were available to the Celts and people living in North India and in the Aegean, and then they just sort of selectively chose ones and deleted others. But I don't know, I'm almost compelled to think that there's something a little bit more fishy or complicated going on. I don't really have an answer for it. All I know is that there's a lot of scholarship on the Aphrodite/Ishtar connection, and that's been used very persistently to explain what's going on in Book 5 of the Iliad. But I see the Indic and the Irish material as being equally compelling. Just it's different, but it's as compelling. I don't really know what the ultimate relevance or how it all fits together might be, but that's my best answer for you right now. Yes.
Just a remark about this question. Two small remarks. It's going to have to be Sumerian and not Semitic if you want.
Oh, sure, yeah.
On Proto-Indo-European level.
That's true.
It's too early for
yeah, correct.
But then again, it's not so early and it's not so Proto-Indo-European. Of course, there's the Hittite Gilgamesh, and
yeah.
conservative as I am on positive contacts between literatures over Anatolia, it's always something worth mentioning.
Sure, yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that correction.
Okay. Another short question? Okay, well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Northern Soviet, the last talk of this session, Riccardo.
Thank you very much, Professor, and many thanks to Laura Massetti for organizing this amazing conference. In this presentation, I shall attempt to analyze, both from a Germanic perspective and from an Indo-European one, some features of an Old Norse mythical narrative, namely the myth of Balder, in order to point out some close parallels in another Indo-European mythological tradition, namely the Vedic Sanskrit one. More precisely, I will start with the formal analysis and semantic interpretation of some names attested in the Norse myth, and I will then attempt to use the insight obtained in order to give a new interpretation of Baldur's myth, which finds correspondences in the Vedic myth of the wounded son. So, you should all have a handout in front of you. Let's start with the myth of Baldur's love for Nanna and death at the hands of Loki and Höder in section A1 of the handout. The main sources for the myth of Balder are the Eddic poems Völuspá, Baldursdraumar, and Lokasenna, and the prose version of the Gylfaginning. The plot elements which are most relevant to us today may be summarized as follows. The god Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, is so bright that light shines from him. His wife is Nanna Nepsdottir, which means daughter of Neper or Neper. While playing a game with the other gods, Balder is unintentionally killed by the blind god Höder, who is maneuvered like a puppet by the mischievous god Loki. After Balder's death, all the gods are confused and perplexed, and they send the god Hermodr to search for Balder. He finds Balder in the realm of the dead, but in order to bring Balder back to life, every creature of the world has to weep for his death, and when this fails to happen, Balder is forced to stay among the dead until the end of time. A Latin pseudo-historical version of this myth occurs in Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum. Even though it is a text of a different genre, namely a heroic legend, several mythological elements are preserved. Let us briefly summarize those which are relevant to us. The demigod Balderus, son of Othinus, falls in love with the maiden Nanna after spying on her while she is bathing. Balderus woos Nanna, and she refuses him, because she loves her adoptive brother Hötherus, who loves her back and decides to kill Balderus. After several vicissitudes, Hötherus pierces Balderus with his sword, and Balderus dies. And later, during her talk, Professor Jamieson will tell us more about what happens after Baldur's death. But now let's turn our attention in section A2 of the handout to the Vedic myth of the sun's love for dawn and of his wounding by fire with darkness, which has been reconstructed by Stephanie Jamieson in 1991 and which was further analyzed by Peter Jackson-Rova in 2006. The elements of the plot which are mostly important to us today are the following. Father Sky, or the sun, desires the maiden Ushas, Dawn, who in the Rig Veda is referred to as daughter of the sky or of the sun. As a punishment for his incestuous desire, he is pierced with darkness by the fire god Agni. The sun falls from the heavens, all living beings are confused and perplexed, of course. The gods realize the danger and they send a character named Atri to find the sun. Atri succeeds and thus restores cosmic order. Now, what I propose to do today, section A3, is to take into account the data from comparative historical linguistics and poetics, both from a Germanic and an Indo-European perspective, in order to develop new formal analysis and semantic interpretations for the names of Baldur's wife, Nanna Nepstoti, and of his murderer, Höder. Interpretations which will allow us to identify the myth of Baldur's death as a Norse counterpart to the Vedic myth of the wounded sun. Now, let us first turn our attention to the Old Norse names on page 2, section B of the handout. According to the current etymology, Nanna is identical to the Old Norse noun Nanna, maiden, woman, which is interpreted either as a lalvort or as the reflex of a word meaning brave. Her patronymic Nepstoti, of course, means daughter of Nefer, a name which is otherwise almost never attested and whose etymology is unclear. And finally, the name Höder is currently analyzed as a derivative of the Old Norse feminine noun höd, battle. But this derivation and semantics find no support in the text, where Höder is never presented as a war god. So let's start with Old Norse Nanna Nepstoti in section B1 of the handout. Old Norse Nanna is indeed identical to the noun meaning maiden, woman, which was probably either a lalvort, like dialectal Swedish Nanna, mother, Latin nonna, Italian mamma, or the reflex of a Proto-Germanic term, nantho, meaning the desired one, from the root nent, to strive, which is attested by Gothic Ananantian, or to dare, or Old Norse nenna, to strive. What is really relevant to us today, however, is that from a synchronic perspective, Nanna clearly means maiden, for instance within the kennings for Valkyrie. See text 1. Now are listed the maidens of Herjan, ready to ride over the earth, the Valkyries, where Herjan is a name of Odin, and maiden of Odin is a kenning for Valkyrie, of the same type as Yggdrasil, maiden of Ugr, another name of Odin. Now, the meaning maiden for the name Nanna closely matches her characterization as a maiden in Saxo's Gesta Danorum, see text 2. All these accomplishments of the youth pleased Nanna mightily, and she began to seek his embraces, for the valor of a youth will often kindle a maiden. Or text 3, having approached the maiden, where the maiden is again Nanna. Now, let's have a look at the patronymic Nepstoti in section 2 on page 3 of the handout. Nanna, and let's keep in mind that Nanna is the only Norse goddess who is consistently referred to with both name and patronymic Nepstotir, meaning Nep's daughter. Now, two different nominatives are tested for the genitive singular Neps, namely Nefur and Nepur. The original nominative was probably Nefur, as Old Norse Nepur may be the outcome, with analogical leveling from a formation Nevur with genitive singular Neps, the reflex of earlier Neps, by means of the frequent Old Norse development of ps to ps. See, for instance, Old Norse repsing from earlier refsing, punishment. The original genitive singular nefs may in turn be the outcome of nefurs, with loss of r between two consonants, as for instance in the Old Norse genitive singular murks from earlier murkurs, the regular genitive singular of murkur, darkness. So the original nominative and genitive were probably nefur and nevus, respectively, which may be traced back to a protoform nebira. Now, from a formal perspective, Nepstotir is a regular Old Norse patronymic formation of a type which is still regular today in Iceland. See, for instance, the name of linguist Gudrun Thoraldsdottir, daughter of Thorhall. So, the second element, daughter, is of course the reflex of Proto-Germanic duchter and Proto-European dukter, which is also attested by Greek dugater, Vedic duhitar, and Lithuanian dukter. The first element, nefur, on the other hand, is the expected reflex of Proto-Germanic nebis and Proto-European nebhes, a word meaning sky or cloud, which has reflexes in several Indo-European languages, for instance Hittite nebish, sky, or Vedic naphas, humidity, cloud, sky, or Greek nephos, cloud. Another reflex of this word is the Hittite theonym nipas, attested in the Paleo-Assyrian Kulte-Bekanisch text, which has been studied, for instance, by Stefan Höfler, 2015. So since never could have meant either sky or cloud, what did Nepstoti mean? Daughter of the sky or daughter of the cloud? As we shall see in section 3, several Indo-European parallels, and as we saw in the last talk, of course, support an interpretation as daughter of the sky. Let us start with the name of the ancient Greek goddess Kore, which means maiden, and with her epithet Dios to gather, daughter of Zeus. The Greek theonym Zeus is, of course, the reflex of the Proto-European word for sky, together with Vedic Diao and Latin Iovis. Greek to gather, daughter, is, of course, another reflex of the Proto-European word for daughter. Now, as argued by Michel Yanda, the Greek goddess Kore, Dios to gather, daughter of the sky, at least partially reflects features of the ancient Indo-European dawn goddess. And as a matter of fact, our second parallel concerns indeed the Vedic goddess Usha's dawn, who is often called maiden in the Rig Veda, and who has a formulaic patronymic Divo Duhitar, meaning sky's daughter, which exactly matches Greek Dios to gather. Both these epithets occur, for instance, in text 4, which you can read on page 4 of the handout. So we may already notice at this point that the phraseological parallels between Old Norse Nanna Nepstotie, Greek Kore Dios to gather, and Vedic, for instance, Kana Divo Duhitar, allow for the reconstruction of a Proto-European collocation, maiden, sky's daughter. But let us turn our attention to our third parallel, namely the Lithuanian epithet of the sun goddess, Dievo Dukte or Dukrite, meaning daughter of Dievas. The Lithuanian sun goddess has been identified as another reflex of the Proto-European dawn goddess. Lithuanian Dievas is, of course, a reflex of Proto-European Deivo, the heavenly one, or sometimes the sky god, which is itself a derivative of Diev, the word for sky, attested by Zeus, by Greek Zeus and Vedic Diao. Now, given that Lithuanian Dukte is another reflex of the Proto-European word for daughter, Lithuanian Dievo Dukte, Greek Dios to gather, and Vedic Divo Duhitar have been analyzed as reflexes of the same etymologically identical formulaic collocation, sky's daughter, which was probably an exclusive epithet of the Proto-European dawn goddess. And today, I would like to propose that Old Norse Nepstotir, daughter of Nefur, meaning sky, is a reflex of this same ancient formulaic material. So to sum up, Nanna Nepstotir, maiden sky daughter, may be analyzed as the Old Norse reflex of two formulaic epithets of the Proto-European dawn goddess, with parallels in Greek Kore Dios to gather, Vedic Kana Divo Duhitar, and Lithuanian Dievo Dukte. Let us now turn our attention to the Old Norse theonym Höder in section B2 of the handout. Höder is the expected Old Norse outcome of Proto-Germanic hatu, and given that the suffix u was not productive in Proto-Germanic, it must be probably traced back to Proto-European kotu, which looks like the generalized strong stem of a Proto-European uploading formation kotu ketu, a derivative of the Proto-European root ket, conceal, which is attested, for instance, by Vedic Chatant, concealing himself, and which has an S mobile variant, sket, which occurs, for instance, in Old English shadow, and Greek skotos, shadow, darkness. As for the semantics, this formation may originally have meant either A, concealment, an abstract meaning which would be expected for this formation type, or B, it may have had a more concrete meaning, shadow, darkness, which may be reconstructed on the basis of the Gothic, Old English, Greek, and Old Irish evidence, and which, as you can see on page 5, would match Höder's epithets and characterization in myth, which seem to reflect an original association of this character with darkness. Firstly, Höder is referred to as the Blindi Aus, the blind, sightless god, which antithetically parallels the Indo-European conception of the sun as he who sees everything. See, for instance, text 5 from the Iliad. And you, sun, who see all things and hear all things. Secondly, Höder is referred to as Baldr's Bani, the killer of Baldr, a god who, in text 6, is said to be so bright that light shines from him. And this lethal opposition between the blind Höder and the bright Baldr reminds us of the Old Norse epithet of the night, Olios, the not bright one, which is a negation of the adjective lios, bright. Now, section 2, there are some inner Germanic parallels for this analysis, namely, number 1, Gothic scadus, Old English shadow, and the other reflexes of Proto-Germanic scadua, shadow, which may be the outcome of Proto-European skotuo, meaning dark provided with concealment, a possessive derivative of the same formation, skotu, concealment, darkness, reflected by Old Norse Höder. The expected meaning was probably still present in Proto-Germanic, as you can see in the handout, and the trivial semantic shift from dark provided with darkness to shadow has parallels, for instance, in modern English, in the dark, or German, im Dunkel. Also, number 2, there are further Germanic parallels for the root variant without s mobile, ket, the one attested by Old Norse Hödur, namely several Germanic reflexes of Proto-Indo-European koto, concealing, an adjunctive derivative of the type of Greek tomos, cutting. Among these is the family of the English word hat, see point A on the reflexes of Proto-Germanic hatan, hat, and also page 6, the family of the English word hood, see point B on the reflexes of Proto-Germanic hoda, meaning hood, hat. Finally, section 3, 2 close Indo-European parallels for our etymology of Hödur may be mentioned, namely, number 1, Old Irish scat, shadow, reflection, mirror, shelter, and the other reflexes of Proto-Celtic scatu, which was probably the outcome of another derivative of Proto-European scotu, concealment, shadow. And our second Indo-European parallel concerns Vedic Mantra, a term attested 3 times in the Rig Veda, whose synchronic meaning is at the time of the hiding of the moon, and whose second element, chatu, hiding, is an archaic hu stem which must be analyzed as a reflex of a Proto-Indo-Iranian noun, katu, chatu, hiding, which would perfectly match the Proto-Indo-European formation kotu, ketu, concealment, which we have reconstructed for Old Norse Hödur. So, to sum up, the Old Norse Hödur is a reflex of Proto-Indo-European kotu, ketu, concealment, shadow, darkness, an interpretation supported by indirect parallels in the Germanic and Celtic lexicon, and by the exact match with Vedic Mantra, the time of the hiding of the moon. Now, let's make use of the insight obtained so far to see if we can gain a new understanding of the myth of Baldur's love for Nanna and death at the hands of Loki and Hödur in section C1. The most important elements of the narrative that we need to keep in mind are, number 1, the male protagonist is a god associated with light, namely Baldur, who in text 7 is said to be so fair in appearance and so bright that light shines from him. Please go to page 7 of the handout. Number 2, Baldur's love interest is Nanna, maiden, the daughter of Nevr, sky, see texts 8 and 9. Number 3, the maiden Nanna is spied upon by Baldur while she is bathing, see text 10. Number 4, Baldur is pierced by the blind god Hödur, meaning darkness, who, as you can see in text 11, is only a puppet in the hands of Loki, the real killer of Baldur, who was originally a fire god. Number 5, after Baldur is pierced to death, all the gods are confused and perplexed at first, see text 12. And finally, number 6, the gods send a character named Hermodur to search for Baldur, and he succeeds in finding him, see text 13. Now, let's turn our attention back to the Vedic myth of the sun's love for dawn and of his wounding by fire with darkness on page 8 of the handout, section C2. The main correspondences between this myth and the Norse myth of Balder are the following. Number 1, the male protagonist is a god associated with light, namely Father Sky, as in text 14, or the sun, as in text 15. Number 2, the male light god desires dawn, who in the Rig Veda is called the maiden and daughter of the sky, for instance in text 16, where Father Sky tries to rape the maiden who is his own daughter, that is Dawn. Number 3, in the Rig Veda, the goddess Dawn is described as a woman who is spied upon while she is bathing, see text 18, where Dawn, like a beauty who knows her body, has stood up erect like a bather for us to see. Number 4, the male light god is pierced with darkness by the god Agni, fire, who is called Svarbhanu in text 19, when Osan Svarbhanu Asura pierced you with darkness. Number 5, after the male light god is wounded, all living beings are confused and perplexed, see text 20. And finally, please go to page 9. Number 6, the gods send a character named Atri to search for the male light god, see text 21. Now, the several correspondences in the phraseology, onomastics, and narrative structures of the Norse and Vedic myths, as we shall see in section C3, seem to point to a common origin for the Norse myth of Baldur's death and the Vedic myth of the wounding of the sky or of the sun. On the basis of these common elements, we may reconstruct an Indo-European myth of a light god's love and wounding, in which, number 1, the male protagonist is a god associated with light. Number 2, the light god's love interest is a maiden, who is the daughter of the sky. Number 3, the maiden is described as being seen while she is bathing. Number 4, the light god is pierced, and not just hit or slain, by a fire god with the aid of darkness. Number 5, after the light god is pierced, all gods and living beings in general are in a state of confusion, of course, being in the dark. Number 6, the gods send a character to search for the light god, and the character succeeds in finding it. So let us summarize the results of this study in section D of the handout. Old Norse Nanna means maiden. Old Norse Neve is the reflex of Proto-Indo-European nepes, sky, cloud. Therefore, Nanna Nepstotir is the maiden, sky's daughter. This interpretation is supported by matches in Greek, where Kore, maiden, is also the daughter of Zeus, the sky, and the sky god, and in Vedic, where the goddess Dawn is referred to both as a maiden and as sky's daughter. A partial match occurs in Lithuanian, where the sun goddess is called daughter of Dievas, who was originally a sky god. Old Norse Höder is the reflex of Proto-Indo-European kotu ketu, concealment, shadow, darkness, a derivative of the root ket, conceal, with an exact match in Vedic chatu, mams chatu, hiding of the moon, and with further parallels in Germanic skadua, shadow, and Celtic skadu, shallow. The same root variant without s mobile, ket, is also tested by the Proto-Germanic words for hat and for hood. Both these interpretations find further support in the data from comparative mythology, as the onomastics, phraseology, and narrative structure of Baldr's myth appear to match closely those of the Vedic myth of the sky or the sun's love for dawn and wounding by fire with darkness. The correspondences allow for the reconstruction of an Indo-European myth of the light god's love and wounding, in which a god who is associated with light falls in love with the maiden who is the daughter of the sky, that is, dawn, and is thereafter pierced as a punishment by the fire god with the aid of darkness, represented either as an object or as a divine personification. Thank you very much.
Yes.
This is lovely, and you've produced a number of structures and so on. But the one question I would have, or one of the questions I would have, is are you then saying that the incest theme, which is the major reason for the punishment of the son in the Vedic myth, is not part of the original myth, or and came in from someplace else? I mean, or not? Because there's no, the punishment isn't a reason for punishment in the Germanic stuff isn't clear, and certainly not incest.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that's not what I'm saying. I actually think that the incest motive is probably inherited. And when I say this, I think about Saxo's narrative, where Nanna, when she refuses Balderus, she actually says that it's unlawful, or I don't quite remember, but she said that it's not right. It's for a mortal to love a god. So I'm inclined to think that this detail could actually reflect the original theme of the incest, so of the unlawful union between Nanna and the light god.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that might be a little more complicated to.
Yeah, it's hard to do that in 20 minutes.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Sorry, I can't hear you.
I seem to remember that in the Battle of the World, that all the sons of Odin but I suppose we don't know what the solstice is, or whether it has been significant. If that is in there, so that would make Nanna part of the
Yeah. So, well, firstly, thank you, and secondly, yeah, I don't really. well, it's interesting material. They're always interesting material, these catalogs, but they're a little arbitrary sometimes. Like you find all sorts of stuff in there. So, given that there are no myths with Nep or Nepr or Nefer, apart from this one, I wouldn't. Personally, I don't usually trust the catalogs when they say stuff like "Son of Odin," because, for instance, "Son of Odin" looks like, given that Odin is the old Alfather or Alfather, like, so he's the old father. So "Son of Odin" could actually be just a generic way to say God, or someone who is in the extended family of Odin, which is the Aesir, so the gods. So I personally don't trust those catalogs, but still, it could be interesting to further have a look at these. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Riccardo. So very interesting indeed. So the only point which I'm not quite convinced by is the etymology of Hilda. Well, I mean, so you don't discuss it, but the most straightforward connection would be so with the health battle, yeah. So in Old North, and so which is very well represented in Germanic languages, and actually it's like one to one, yeah.
Yeah.
While in the case of the darkness connection, so you still need to explain why. Only in this case you don't have this as mobile or whatever. And I'm afraid, yeah. So if you will be like weighting so these two possibilities against each other, yeah. So the choice will be not so obvious. Yeah. And so like if you see the properties of other from mythological point of view, so this connection with battle, strife, which is actually finally may go back to the idea of anger and enmity and so on. And his blindness is also quite well square. Well, so that's my observation.
Thank you. Well, firstly, one of the reasons why I actually added these Germanic parallels with initial age, so like hood and hat, is to show that actually the variant without s mobile is attested in Germanic and in very common words. Yes. So, and secondly, about the well, of course, it's a methodological question. So, if you like, if what you're looking for is perfect phonetic resemblance, of course, then you're welcome to connect Höder with Höd. But methodologically, I, as someone working with poetics and religion, I believe that a name or the epithet of a god often, if not always, but definitely often, has a connection with this god, with these god's features, and yeah, the war connection is just non-existent. There's no reason to connect Höder with war. Actually, the fact that he's blind is the reason why Loki, actually in the myth, you probably know it, but the myth goes this way. All the gods are doing this weird game where they're throwing stuff, trying to hit Baldur, and the only one who's not doing it is Höder, because he's blind, and that's exactly what he says. I can't hit Baldur because I am blind. So Loki goes there, goes and tells him, "Come on, let's play together. I will guide you." So, like, to think that Höder is a war god, it's completely against the Germanic, Norse, and, to be honest, reasonable idea of a warrior, like a blind warrior who doesn't take part in the game that all the gods except for him are taking part in, which is throwing stuff at Balder. So yeah, so I also think that the derivation of Höder from Höd battle would be a little weird from a derivational point of view. Like I can't think of any parallels, but we can discuss about this. But just for the semantics, I would say that it just doesn't fit. But thank you very much. Good comment.
Just a small comment. Thank you. I was wondering about this Nepes and so on. Isn't it neuter in most languages? So I was wondering, do you have any indications elsewhere of animation, personification of this noun? Because I think that there have been, others have noticed this tendency in many Indo-European languages. Words for fire, water, and so on, that they occur in pairs, or one is inanimate and the other typically animate. But would you have find any support in other languages for this nepes being used as an epithet of a god?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That's the reason why I mentioned Stefan Höfler's analysis of the Hittite theonym Nipas as a derivative of Nebdes. It's in page 3.
Oh, okay, I see. Sorry, I wasn't noticing.
Yeah. So I think this is Stefan here. But anyway, I think this is Stefan's analysis, right? Like it's your, or are you quoting someone? I don't remember in the article.
I'm not the first one who came up with this.
Okay. But anyways, you can find it in Stefan's article. So basically, yeah, that's a reason why the reason why I added, because I also thought it's a neuter. Yeah, I had your same concerns. Well, thank God, Stefan helped me.
Okay, last question. Short one, please.
That's bravissimo. Just one point on your page 2.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, in your 6th link site about hostility and the like, yeah? So perhaps you could add here the current view nowadays in the last years, thanks to Craig Maker. He has attempted to make the difference between Katu. Katu is actually evilness that one makes or that one decides to do or that one receives. Whereas Kat or Germanic Hadu is actually Baldr, simply. Yeah. So I don't see any reason to separate them totally. But a common view now is that battle is an activity and hostility is a state. I don't think so. But perhaps you could take into account and not compromise yourself with Kotu, Katu, and so on. Yeah. In fact, probably if one takes into consideration the derivatives of this one, one can reconstruct one single root. Yeah, but nowadays the tendency is to make two different, and in your case it's not your problem, but
okay,
you may you get this problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
The sounds of Indo-European too, by Melchior.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, the discussion can go on around a cup of coffee. I think. Thank you, Ed.